WWII, France, July 2nd, 1916, 0730 hours. And Lieutenant Colonel Adrien Carton de Viart stands in a shell crater on the Somme, his left hand mangled beyond recognition, blood streaming down his face from a fresh wound to his skull, German machine gun fire tearing the air around him, while his men of the 8th Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment desperately try to hold a position they've captured at terrible cost. The one-eyed Belgian-born British officer, already missing half his left hand from an earlier wound, watches as enemy counterattacks threaten to overrun his position. What the German soldiers advancing toward him cannot possibly know, what no soldier facing Adrien Carton de Viart could imagine, is that this 36-year-old officer is virtually unkillable, that he will survive this day despite wounds that would kill most men, that he will continue fighting through 2 more years of World War I, survive World War II including a plane crash and escape from a prisoner of war camp, and live to age 83, having been shot in the face, head, stomach, ankle, leg, hip, ear and hand, having survived wounds that doctors said were fatal, having been left for dead on battlefields twice, and having written in his memoirs that, frankly, he had enjoyed the war. The German army has every reason to believe that the British attack on this sector of the Somme will collapse like so many others, that their defensive positions, reinforced by concrete bunkers and interlocking fields of machine gun fire, will break the British assault, that the officers leading these attacks will die like the thousands already rotting in no man's land. But what the Germans defending La Boiselle do not comprehend is that they face someone who views combat not as horror to be endured, but as challenge to be embraced, whose courage borders on madness, who will pull grenade pins with his teeth because his left hand is too damaged to grip anything, and whose refusal to acknowledge the possibility of death inspires his men to achieve what military doctrine says is impossible. Adrien Carton de Viart's path to becoming what history would call the unkillable soldier began not in military academies or on parade grounds, but in Brussels, Belgium, on May 5, 1880, born into aristocratic privilege that should have led to comfortable obscurity rather than legendary status. His mother, the daughter of an Irish merchant, died when Adrien was only 6 years old, leaving him to be raised primarily by his father, a prominent lawyer who moved the family to Cairo, Egypt, seeking new opportunities and escape from grief. Young Adrien grew up in Cairo's expatriate community, learning Arabic fluently, developing a love for adventure and physical challenge that would define his character, showing no interest in the quiet professional life his father envisioned for him. There were whispers, never confirmed but persistent, that Adrien was actually the illegitimate son of King Leopold II of Belgium, explaining both his aristocratic connections and the independent streak that made him unsuitable for conventional society. His education followed the pattern expected of wealthy Europeans, attending Catholic boarding schools in England, studying at Balliol College, Oxford, finding himself bored by academic life and yearning for something more exciting than lectures and examinations. When the Second Boer War erupted in South Africa in 1899, 19-year-old Adrien saw his opportunity, dropping out of Oxford without permission, lying about his age, and obtaining a commission as a trooper in the British Army. His father, furious at this abandonment of education and social position, demanded he return to university, but Adrien had discovered what would become his life's passion: warfare. The Boer War proved less romantic than Adrien had imagined, consisting mostly of chasing irregular forces across vast distances, sleeping in the open, enduring heat and dust, experiencing the unglamorous reality of colonial warfare. But he loved every moment of it, writing home about the adventure, the freedom from social conventions, the simplicity of life where survival depended on courage and competence rather than birth or wealth. Adrien's first wound came during a skirmish near Ladysmith, taking a bullet through the stomach, an injury that should have killed him through blood loss or infection, in an era when battlefield medicine was primitive at best. He survived, recovered at a field hospital, and returned to his unit against medical advice, demonstrating the pattern that would repeat throughout his military career. Get wounded, refuse to acknowledge the severity, return to combat as quickly as possible. After the Boer War ended in 1902, Adrien faced a choice between returning to civilian life or pursuing a military career that offered modest pay, limited advancement for someone without connections, and the prospect of being stationed in boring garrison posts far from action. He chose the military without hesitation, obtaining a commission in the British Army, serving with various regiments in India and East Africa, always volunteering for the most dangerous assignments, building a reputation as an officer whose courage was unquestionable, even if his judgment seemed reckless. In 1914, Adrian was serving with the Somaliland Camel Corps in East Africa, when reports reached him of tribal rebellions requiring suppression. He volunteered immediately for combat duty, leading camel-mounted troops against the forces of the so-called Mad Mullah, Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, in terrain where European officers typically died from disease, heat or ambush. During one engagement, a dervish rifleman shot Adrian through the left eye, the bullet entering just below the eye socket, destroying the eye itself and exiting through the back of his skull, without hitting his brain or spine. His men found him lying unconscious in the sand, blood pooling around his head, apparently dead or dying. They prepared to evacuate his body when Adrian regained consciousness, sat up, and demanded to know why everyone was standing around instead of pursuing the enemy. The doctor who examined him stated flatly that Adrian should be dead, that the bullet had missed his brain by millimeters, that he needed immediate evacuation to a proper hospital. Adrian refused evacuation, insisting he could still fight despite having only one eye, continuing to lead his troops through the remainder of the campaign, though he did consent to wearing a black eye patch that would become his trademark appearance for the rest of his life. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Carton de Viart, now 34 years old and sporting his distinctive eye patch, rushed back to England, demanding assignment to the Western Front, arguing that his experience and injuries made him valuable rather than unfit for service. The British Army, desperate for experienced officers as the war consumed leaders at catastrophic rates, assigned him to command positions, despite concerns about his fitness. Adrian arrived in France in early 1915, took command of the 4th Dragoon Guards, and immediately impressed his superiors with his aggressive leadership style and complete disregard for personal safety. He led cavalry charges against German positions long after cavalry had become obsolete, participating in trench raids that were essentially suicide missions, exposing himself to enemy fire with such regularity that his men began to believe he was immortal. During the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, Adrian was leading an attack when German artillery fire caught his company in the open. Shrapnel tore through his left hand, shattering bones, severing tendons, turning his hand into a mangled mess that could no longer grip a weapon or hold reins. The field surgeon who examined the wound recommended immediate amputation to prevent gangrene, but then hesitated, suggesting they wait to see if the hand might heal enough to retain some function. Adrian, impatient with medical caution and understanding that a damaged hand was useless in combat, grabbed the mangled fingers himself and tore them off, finishing the job the surgeon had been reluctant to start. He wrapped the bloody stumps in bandages, refused evacuation, and returned to his battalion the same day, learning to fight with only his right hand, developing techniques for pulling grenade pins with his teeth, becoming even more aggressive now that he had less to lose. By July 1916, when the Battle of the Somme commenced, with the most catastrophic single day in British military history, Adrian commanded the 8th Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment, leading men who were terrified of the German defences they were ordered to assault, but more terrified of disappointing their one-eyed, one-handed colonel, who seemed to view combat as sport. The initial British assault on July 1st resulted in 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead, cut down by German machine guns that the British artillery had failed to destroy, exposing the folly of tactics that sent infantry walking across open ground toward entrenched positions. Adrian's battalion was held in reserve during the initial disaster, waiting their turn to attack positions the Germans had reinforced and resupplied. On July 2nd, Adrian received orders to assault La Boiselle, a fortified village that has already repulsed multiple British attacks, where German defenders occupied concrete bunkers connected by deep trenches, where machine gun positions covered every approach route, where artillery observers could direct accurate fire on any concentration of troops. Adrian studied the objective through his single eye, recognized that conventional tactics would fail, decided that the only chance of success lay in speed and violence, that would overwhelm defenders before they could organize effective resistance. He briefed his officers with characteristic brevity, explaining that they would advance at a run rather than a walk, that they would not stop the wounded, that anyone who hesitated would be shot by Adrian personally, though his men understood this was not empty threat but statement of fact about what combat with Adrian Carton de Viart entailed. The attack began at dawn, with Adrian leading from the front as he always did, his men following not because orders compelled them, but because following this mad, one-eyed colonel somehow felt safer than staying behind. German machine guns opened fire the moment British troops emerged from their trenches, cutting down the first wave, creating a carpet of bodies that following waves had to climb over. Adrian ran forward through the fire, pulling grenades with his teeth, throwing them with his one good hand, shooting Germans with his revolver at point-blank range, somehow never hit, despite presenting an obvious target in his officer's uniform with its distinctive insignia. His men, witnessing their colonel's apparent immunity to bullets, followed with renewed courage, convinced that if the old man with one eye and one hand could survive this hell, perhaps they could too. The fighting for La Boiselle lasted 3 days, 72 hours of continuous combat, where attacks and counterattacks blurred together, where positions changed hands multiple times, where the dead from both sides piled up in trenches and shell craters, where water ran out and men drank from mud puddles mixed with blood. Adrian was everywhere, organising defences when Germans counterattacked, leading charges when opportunities emerged, pulling wounded men to safety between firefights, refusing sleep or rest or medical attention for the multiple wounds he accumulated. On the morning of July 2nd, a German sniper's bullet struck him in the back of the head, the round glancing off his skull rather than penetrating, opening a gash that bled profusely, but failed to penetrate bone. Adrian barely noticed, wrapping a bandage around his head and continuing to fight, blood streaming down his neck and staining his uniform. Later that same day, during a German counterattack, Adrian was organising a defensive position when an artillery shell exploded near him, the concussion knocking him unconscious, shrapnel tearing through his ankle. His men, convinced he was dead this time, prepared to evacuate his body to the rear, but Adrian regained consciousness after several minutes, discovered he could still walk despite the mangled ankle, and resumed command as if nothing had happened, hobbling between positions, shouting encouragement to his troops, directing fire against German positions, when his left hand, already missing several fingers, was struck again by shrapnel that shattered what remained. Adrian simply wrapped it tighter and continued using his revolver in his right hand. By July 4th, La Boiselle was secure, the Germans having withdrawn after sustaining casualties they could not afford, the British holding positions they had purchased, with thousands of lives. Adrian's battalion had suffered 75% casualties, losing most of its strength in 3 days of fighting, but had accomplished its objective when other units had failed. Adrian himself, wounded multiple times, having been knocked unconscious twice, left for dead by his own men on 2 separate occasions, refused evacuation, insisting on remaining with what was left of his battalion. The division commander, touring the front lines and inspecting the carnage, encountered Adrian sitting in a shell crater, his head bandaged, his ankle swollen to twice its normal size, his mangled hand wrapped in bloody cloth, calmly eating a tin of bully beef and discussing tactical situations as if they were at staff college, rather than in a battlefield that resembled the surface of the moon. The citation for Adrian's Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration, read in typically understated British fashion that he had displayed most conspicuous bravery, coolness and determination during severe operations of a prolonged nature, and that it was owing in a great measure to his dauntless courage and inspiring example that a serious reverse was averted. The official citation could not capture what his men understood, that Adrian Carton de Weert was either insane or immortal, and that following him into combat meant accepting that normal rules about mortality and survival did not apply. When King George V personally presented Adrian with his Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace, the king reportedly asked how he had survived such wounds, and Adrian answered with complete sincerity that he had been lucky, apparently viewing survival with one eye, one functional hand, and multiple bullets in his body as good fortune rather than miraculous. Adrian returned to the Western Front immediately after receiving his Victoria Cross, refusing the staff position or training command that decorated heroes typically received, insisting that his place was in combat leading men. Over the next 2 years, he would be wounded 4 more times, each injury that would end most soldiers' careers barely slowing him down. At the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, perhaps the most horrific engagement of the entire war, where men drowned in mud and the wounded simply disappeared into shell craters filled with water, Adrian took a bullet through the hip, the round entering from the side and exiting without hitting major organs or shattering his pelvis. He had the wound dressed at a field hospital, and returned to his battalion the same day, limping noticeably, but refusing to show weakness that might undermine his men's morale. At Arras in 1917, a German machine gunner shot away what remained of Adrian's left ear, the bullet passing so close to his head that it burned his skin with muzzle flash, leaving him partially deaf on that side. Adrian's comment, recorded by an aide who witnessed the incident, was that he had never liked that ear anyway, and was glad to be rid of it. At Cambrai in 1918, during one of the last great battles of the war, Adrian was shot through the leg, the bullet missing the femoral artery by millimetres, but fracturing his shin bone. This wound finally forced him to accept evacuation, not because he wanted medical treatment, but because he literally could not walk on the broken leg. Even then, he argued with doctors about the necessity of removing him from command, insisting that he could lead from a stretcher if necessary, finally accepting hospitalization only when his commanding officer made it a direct order rather than a suggestion. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, Adrian was in a London hospital recovering from his leg wound, frustrated at missing the final offensive, genuinely disappointed that the war had ended before he could return to France. His reaction to peace, recorded in his memoirs, was characteristically contrarian. "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." This statement, shocking to civilians and to most soldiers who had experienced the trenches, perfectly captured Adrian's unique psychology. For him, warfare represented the ultimate test of skill and courage, a realm where social conventions and peacetime constraints disappeared, where leadership meant personal bravery rather than political maneuvering, where life simplified to basic questions of survival and victory. He genuinely mourned the war's end, not from love of death or suffering, but from recognition that civilian life would never provide the intensity and purpose he found in combat. The interwar years proved difficult for Adrian, as they did for many soldiers who had thrived in wartime but struggled with peace. He held various military positions in Poland during the Russo-Polish War of 1919 to 1920, commanding a British mission and earning Polish military decorations for his service. He served as British liaison officer in Poland through the 1930s, developing deep affection for the Polish people and their military, learning Polish and Russian to add to his collection of languages, which now included English, French, Arabic, and Italian. But these peacetime assignments, however interesting, lacked the immediacy and danger he craved. He was too senior and too decorated to be given combat commands in the minor colonial conflicts where Britain was engaged, too unconventional and too independent to be trusted with staff positions requiring diplomatic skills and political awareness. When World War II erupted in September 1939, 59-year-old Adrien Carton de Viard, now a Major General, was serving as head of the British military mission to Poland. The German invasion found him in Warsaw, watching the Polish military mount desperate resistance against Wehrmacht forces that enjoyed overwhelming advantages in armour, aircraft, and tactical doctrine. Adrian accompanied Polish forces as they retreated eastward, experiencing bombardment from German aircraft, witnessing the collapse of defensive positions, seeing another army destroyed by modern warfare. When the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east on September 17th, implementing the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Poland's situation became hopeless. Adrian was evacuated through Romania, frustrated at being unable to help defend a country he had grown to love, returning to Britain determined to find another combat command, despite his age and his collection of injuries. The British Army, desperate for experienced commanders as it rebuilt after the Dunkirk evacuation, appointed Adrian to command an expeditionary force being sent to Norway in April 1940, tasked with supporting Norwegian resistance against the German invasion. The Norway campaign proved disastrous for multiple reasons, including poor planning, inadequate equipment, German air superiority, and the impossibility of supplying forces across stormy seas while under attack. Adrian commanded the landing at Namsos, attempting to establish a defensive perimeter and support Norwegian forces, finding his troops equipped for desert warfare rather than Arctic conditions, facing German mountain troops who were better trained and better supplied. The campaign collapsed within weeks, with British forces evacuating under heavy German pressure, having accomplished nothing except providing another demonstration that unprepared armies could not stop German blitzkrieg tactics. Adrian's next assignment, in April 1941, placed him as commander of British forces in Yugoslavia, where he was supposed to coordinate with Yugoslav partisans resisting German occupation. But before he could even establish his headquarters, his plane crashed during the flight to Yugoslavia. The crash occurred over the Mediterranean when the aircraft, a lumbering transport bomber, suffered engine failure and went down off the coast of North Africa. Adrian, now 61 years old, survived the crash that killed several other passengers, found himself floating in the Mediterranean Sea along with other survivors, knowing that without rescue they would die from exposure or sharks within hours. Italian forces, controlling that section of Mediterranean, picked up the survivors and transported them to prisoner of war camps in Italy, marking the beginning of Adrian's experience as a POW. Most 61-year-old generals, especially those with one eye, one functional hand, and a collection of old wounds that caused constant pain, would have accepted prisoner status as an honourable end to their war service. Adrian viewed captivity as a temporary inconvenience, requiring immediate escape. Italian authorities, recognising they held a senior British general, placed him in a high-security facility where escape was considered impossible. Adrian studied the camp for months, identifying weaknesses in the security system, recruiting other prisoners to help with the escape attempt, planning every detail with the same thoroughness he had applied to military operations. In August 1943, he and several other officers tunnelled out of the camp, making their way toward Allied lines that were still hundreds of miles away through German-occupied territory. The escape attempt failed after 8 days, when Italian police recaptured Adrian and his companions near a railway station, where they were trying to board a train heading south. Adrian was 63 years old at this point, half-blind, with one functioning hand, carrying old wounds that had never properly healed. Yet he had walked over 100 miles through mountains and hostile territory before being caught. The Italians, both impressed and exasperated by this elderly general's refusal to accept captivity, transferred him to a maximum security facility near Florence, where guards watched him constantly to prevent further escape attempts. Adrian spent the next year planning escapes that never materialized, maintaining physical fitness through exercise routines, corresponding with British authorities through Red Cross channels, and generally making himself a nuisance to his captors, who could not understand why this decorated general would not simply accept honourable confinement. Italy's surrender in September 1943 changed Adrian's situation dramatically, as German forces occupied Italy and assumed control of POW camps holding Allied prisoners. The Germans, recognising Adrian's propaganda value, offered to release him in exchange for German prisoners held by the British. Winston Churchill, who knew Adrian personally and appreciated both his courage and his eccentricities, personally approved the prisoner exchange. Adrian was repatriated to Britain in December 1943, ending his captivity, but also ending his combat career, as even Churchill could not justify sending a 63-year-old, one-eyed general back into active combat, regardless of his willingness. Churchill instead appointed Adrian as his personal representative to China, tasked with liaising between British forces, American forces under General Stilwell, and Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek. This assignment, though technically non-combat, placed Adrian in one of the war's most complex theatres, where Allied unity was fiction, where American and British strategic interests diverged sharply, where Chinese nationalist and communist forces fought each other as much as they fought the Japanese. Adrian performed these diplomatic duties with more skill than anyone expected from a man whose solution to most problems involved attacking them directly. He travelled extensively through China, visiting forward bases, inspecting troops, providing Churchill with frank assessments of situations that diplomats might have softened, earning respect from soldiers of all nations who appreciated his genuine interest in their welfare and his complete lack of pomposity despite his rank and decorations. Adrian remained in China until the war's end in August 1945, witnessing the Japanese surrender, seeing the immediate resumption of Chinese civil war between nationalists and communists, recognising that the peace for which millions had died was already falling apart. He returned to Britain in late 1945, retired from military service at age 65, having served in 3 wars spanning nearly 50 years, having been wounded 11 times by bullets and shrapnel, having survived wounds that killed most men, having been left for dead twice, having escaped from a POW camp at 63, having earned Britain's highest decoration for valour, along with Polish, French, Belgian, and Chinese military honours. Retirement should have killed Adrian faster than bullets ever could, as men who lived for combat often died quickly once removed from the purpose that sustained them. But Adrian proved as unkillable in peacetime as he had been in war, settling in County Cork, Ireland, where he wrote his memoirs with characteristic understatement, fished the local rivers, hunted, and generally enjoyed the physical activities that his injuries should have made impossible. His memoirs, titled Happy Odyssey and published in 1950, became minor classics of military literature, notable for their dry humour, their complete absence of self-pity or boasting, and their honest admission that he had enjoyed warfare in ways that peacetime readers found disturbing. He wrote about his wounds with the casual indifference most people reserve for discussing minor inconveniences, describing being shot in the head or losing body parts as merely annoying interruptions to more important business of fighting. Medical examinations of Adrian in his retirement years revealed that he carried shrapnel and bullet fragments throughout his body, pieces of metal that had migrated from their original entry points, working their way toward the surface over decades, emerging through his skin like military souvenirs. Doctors who examined his collection of scars marvelled that any single wound would have killed most men, let alone the accumulation he had survived. His skull showed fractures from multiple bullet impacts. His hip carried a bullet that had never been removed because surgery would have been more dangerous than leaving it in place. His ankle bones had been shattered and poorly healed, leaving him with a permanent limp, yet he walked miles daily and refused to acknowledge pain or limitation. Adrian Carton de Wiart died peacefully in his sleep on June 5, 1963, at his home in County Cork, Ireland, at age 83, having survived 11 bullet wounds, 2 plane crashes, multiple artillery barrages, a POW camp, and 6 decades of military service that should have killed him many times over. His death from natural causes seemed almost anticlimactic for someone who had survived so much violence, as if death itself had finally tired of trying to kill him through dramatic means and settled for quietly taking him in his sleep. The obituaries published in British newspapers struggled to capture his extraordinary life, reducing decades of courage and eccentricity to lists of wounds and decorations that conveyed facts but missed the essence of the man who had genuinely enjoyed warfare while remaining personally modest and kind. The funeral, held in Ireland with military honours, was attended by veterans of multiple wars, Polish officers who remembered his service to their country, British soldiers who had served under his command, and local Irish residents who knew him as the elderly gentleman who walked the countryside every day, regardless of weather. The eulogies emphasised his courage, his leadership, his service to Britain and allied nations, but they also noted the qualities that made him beloved despite his eccentricities: his genuine concern for common soldiers, his complete absence of class consciousness or snobbery, his willingness to share any hardship he asked his men to endure, his habit of leading from the front, regardless of personal risk. Polish officers, remembering his service during the interwar years and his presence during the 1939 invasion, spoke of him as one of the few British officers who had truly understood Poland and had mourned her defeat as personal tragedy. His Victoria Cross, along with his other decorations including the Polish Virtuti Militari, the French Croix de Guerre, and numerous campaign medals spanning 3 wars, was donated to the National Army Museum in London, where it remains on display, alongside his photograph showing the distinctive eye patch and the slight smile of someone who had seen too much combat to take anything too seriously. Historians studying his military career debate whether his leadership style, characterised by personal courage and aggressive tactics, was brilliant or reckless, whether his Victoria Cross action at La Boiselle represented inspired command or suicidal behaviour that happened to succeed. But his soldiers, the men who followed him through the hell of the Western Front, never questioned his leadership, remembering him not as a conventional general, but as someone who shared their dangers, who never ordered them anywhere he would not go first, who somehow survived wounds that killed others and kept fighting when any reasonable person would have collapsed. The phenomenon of Adrian Carton de Wiart, the unkillable soldier who survived both world wars despite wounds that should have killed him multiple times, defies easy explanation. Medical professionals examining his case note that while individual wounds might have been survivable with luck and good medical care, The accumulation of injuries he sustained should have resulted in death from blood loss, infection, organ failure, or simple shock. The bullet to his skull during the Somme should have killed him instantly, or at minimum caused brain damage. The stomach wound in the Boer War should have caused fatal peritonitis. The hand that he tore apart himself should have resulted in deadly infection in an era before antibiotics. Yet he survived all of it, returning to combat each time, seeming to grow stronger rather than weaker from wounds that would have crippled normal men. Psychologists analysing his memoirs and contemporary accounts note unusual psychological profile, someone who genuinely enjoyed combat rather than merely tolerating it, who found purpose and meaning in warfare that civilian life could never provide, whose courage was not absence of fear, but complete indifference to death that made fear irrelevant. Modern understanding of combat stress and PTSD makes his cheerful acceptance of warfare seem almost pathological, yet his personal relationships, his kindness to subordinates, his normal life in retirement all suggest someone psychologically healthy despite his unusual relationship with violence. He was not a sociopath who enjoyed killing. His enjoyment came from the challenge of combat, the test of leadership under extreme pressure, the simplicity of warfare where success was measured in objective terms rather than political manoeuvring. His influence on military culture extended beyond his immediate commands, as his legend spread through British and Commonwealth forces, inspiring soldiers who faced impossible situations by reminding them that survival was possible, regardless of circumstances. During World War II, British soldiers in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe knew about the general, with one eye and one hand, who had survived the Somme and was now escaping from Italian POW camps at 63, his story providing evidence that determination and courage could overcome any obstacle. The fact that he had been left for dead twice during World War I, but had survived to fight in World War II, suggested that death itself could be defied through sheer willpower and refusal to acknowledge defeat. Modern special operations forces, studying historical examples of exceptional soldiers, analyse Adrian's career for lessons about leadership, courage, and resilience under extreme conditions. His habit of leading from the front, sharing all dangers with his men, became standard doctrine in elite units, where officers who ask men to risk their lives must demonstrate willingness to take the same risks. His refusal to acknowledge wounds or limitations resonates with special operations culture that emphasizes mental toughness and refusal to quit regardless of circumstances. His ability to maintain effectiveness despite severe injuries provides case study in human resilience and the power of psychological determination to overcome physical damage. The Swedish power metal band Sabaton, known for songs about military history, commemorated Adrian with The Unkillable Soldier on their 2022 album, introducing his story to new generations who might never have encountered this extraordinary figure through conventional history books. The song captures essential elements of his character: the wounds that should have killed him, the refusal to accept defeat, the genuine enjoyment of warfare that seems incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The fact that rock bands find his story worthy of commemoration alongside famous battles and decorated units speaks to his enduring cultural impact as embodiment of courage that transcends national boundaries and historical periods. In the final analysis, Adrien Carton de Wiart represents something rare in military history. Someone who fought in 2 world wars, survived wounds that would have killed most soldiers, was left for dead twice, escaped from a POW camp as a 63-year-old general, lived to write memoirs about his experiences, and died peacefully at 83, having genuinely enjoyed a military career that most people would view as continuous nightmare. His story challenges assumptions about human limits, about survival under impossible circumstances, about the relationship between courage and common sense. The one-eyed, one-handed general pulling grenade pins with his teeth, while German machine guns tore through his battalion at La Boiselle, was not behaving rationally by conventional standards. Yet his irrationality inspired men to fight when reason said they should surrender, to follow when logic said they should flee, to survive when probability said they should die. The soldier who survived both world wars, who was twice left for dead on battlefields but refused to die, who lost an eye and a hand and accumulated wounds throughout his body yet kept fighting, who admitted without shame that he had enjoyed warfare, lived a life that seems impossible yet is thoroughly documented through military records, contemporary accounts, and his own modest memoirs. Adrian Carton de Viot's extraordinary career proves that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, that individual courage can achieve results that military doctrine says are impossible, and that the human capacity for survival and determination exceeds what medical science or common sense suggests is possible. Standing in that shell crater on the Somme in July 1916, bleeding from multiple wounds, with his battalion nearly destroyed around him, holding a position that cost thousands of British lives, Adrian Carton de Viot demonstrated that courage is not absence of fear, but refusal to let fear or wounds or probability dictate behaviour. A lesson that remains relevant for anyone facing impossible odds and wondering whether survival is possible. His answer, delivered through decades of service and wounds that would have killed anyone else, was always the same. Keep fighting, keep leading, keep refusing to acknowledge defeat, and death itself may grow tired of trying to kill you.